So this is a very rich and complicated topic, just like the region itself. I want to start maybe, if we could, just thinking about the opportunity. We heard earlier in the discussion about whether customized large language models could be devised for Southeast Asia, that there were all kinds of commercial opportunities that would fall in line with that. And I'm wondering if the same logic applies to governance models. What if you have thoughts as to what the advantages might be of being able to come up with some kind of common framework? And maybe we can think about what that framework might be down the road a bit. But just talk about why the region might have an incentive, whether it's commercial or otherwise, to kind of band together. Gomez, do you want to take the first shot at that?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me on this panel. I sit at a unique intersection being the director for ASEAN Council. We sit pretty close to startups, various tech companies, being from the tech sector ourselves, but at the same time, we engage quite regularly with various governments in the region. And I think what we see is, in terms of ASEAN integrity and there being a digital economy per se, by 2030, we could be the third largest economy in the world if we were one country. There is extensive business potential, but the challenges lie in the fact that it's actually very hard to go across border. So the ability for us to leverage on the true potential that is offered by Southeast Asia is sometimes hampered by lack of, say, for example, simple things like business recognition across border, some issues around cross-border data flow, cybersecurity standards, just to introduce a few that I'm quite sure my co-panelists will dig into. So if we can get a framework together, there is this huge market out there for us. And you do see some bigger markets in the region leaning towards protecting their own domestic market by putting up regulatory barriers. So that sometimes gets in the way of developing a regional framework.
Really interesting. So, and it's an interesting, it's a big opportunity as a market, but it's also a big opportunity from an investment standpoint. Like if you're a VC investor, the ability to be able to invest in a company that operates across an entire region versus just in a single market is huge. And I like your point about it being the third largest economy. It's not only that it's large if you think about it in an aggregate, it's also that it's got great demographics, most of the individual economies in it. And nearly all of them are right now growing at very respectable high growth rates compared to many of the other world's economies. So if you think about that down the road, it really kind of adds up. Evie, what's your take on it?
Yeah, if I could add to the comments you've already made, I think at Credo AI, we're working with enterprises that are highly regulated and they are global in scope and they're operating in these markets all over the world. So not only in this region, but globally, they're looking for that commonality. How can they create a governance framework that is going to stand the test of time, that is not a brittle framework that only works in one jurisdiction or only satisfies particular risk requirements. So we're constantly looking for those elements of commonality, and I think that the benefit of that for businesses is building trust over time in different markets with different regulators, but also having certainty with which they can operate and continue to operate in the long term. So I think we've seen a lot of commonality even between things like the EU AI Act and the White House Executive Order on AI in terms of what the requirements are from enterprises, things like having comprehensive AI governance, risk management systems, transparency reporting, some form of public notice, impact assessments, an AI registry. Things like this are sort of the common elements we're already seeing emerge.
Ziking, how about you? I know you've looked carefully at this.
Yeah, so I personally have been working in this space of convergence for many years around data policies and AI. And the Academy of Law actually has a think tank, the Asian Business Law Institute, that does work firmly in this space. I think it is utterly important for us to really take a step back and look at Southeast Asia as a whole, right? We need to understand the maturity of the economies and also the technology, right? I think majority of Southeast Asian nations are likely to be deployers and users of the AI systems. Yeah. Now, the good thing is that there is a fairly consistent set of principles around responsible AI. You can point to, for example, the OECD AI principles, right, as a set of principles. Now, how do you take a set of principles like this, bring it into Southeast Asia, and achieve two goals? One, to make it a lot easier for companies that are trying to bring products and services into Southeast Asia to very quickly localize the same products and make it a lot easier. The second is, of course, how to assist companies in Southeast Asia to also adapt to that and grow out and expand beyond Southeast Asia. We have actually a very, very useful platform, ASEAN, right? And through ASEAN, it is possible to develop a governance framework for responsible AI modeled after and looking very much like the OECD principles, and use that as a mapping standard so that as individual companies develop their own national frameworks, they're able to map into something like that. The ASEAN framework can be moderated, right, to suit the situation for ASEAN, which is largely deployments, right, of AI system, and also to adjust it such that it's a lot easier for the companies and the governments working in this space.
Huh. Really interesting. I think there are several things there that sort of caught my ear. One is, you know, ASEAN as a framework for this. There's an ongoing discussion really about how ASEAN might kind of work together to come up with a common framework. How far along do you think that is, and is it making progress? Where do we stand right now on that? I mean, obviously, people think about the EU and they think of it as being fractious and always arguing and disagreeing. And they haven't seen anything until they've seen Southeast Asia, right? Much more complex, diverse region, and harder to come together. So where do we stand right now?
I mean, I don't know how many of you here are technologists or from the tech sector. You know how fast technology develops. And then you've worked and interacted with governments. I was from the public sector. Governments, public sector don't move that quickly.
Yeah.
And with AI particularly, the breakneck speed at which different companies are racing to get ahead, get towards AGI, governments are never going to keep up, let alone a multilateral institution like ASEAN. So you need a framework, but you also very quickly need to develop meaningful public-private partnerships. And that can help forward the goal.
That's an important point.
So that's, I'm going to pause there because I can talk endlessly about this.
No, that's really critical, and it's interesting. I mean, the Singapore story definitely underscores that. But do either of you have kind of thoughts about how far along we are in terms of discussions about a framework?
Well, so I'm a glass half full kind of person, right? Yeah. So because I look at it from the perspective is that perspective that number one, ASEAN is not like the EU. The way we are put together is very different. So we can't expect the cohesiveness of EU in terms of policy making. Second, imagine if we didn't have ASEAN. Right?
Yeah.
So while there's a lot that can be said for moving faster, for this kind of organization of association of nations, this is the speed that everyone's comfortable with. It's better than not having something. But I would say for AI governance, it's probably it's likely to take the same kind of pathway that ASEAN took for data protection. You just imagine, back in 2016, the ASEAN ministers for telecommunications adopted a set of data protection principles for ASEAN. Progressively, over the years, they built out the data management framework, model contractual clauses to assist in the cross-border transfer of personal data. It takes time, but with concerted efforts, things can be developed. Now, these are still voluntary frameworks. They are not binding on the governments, but at least they exist. And once they exist, and it's put out by an organization like ASEAN, there is a bit of impetus to say, let's make use of them and let's try to be coherent. I can imagine that for AI, the same path might be taken as well. I think the first step has already been taken. The responsible AI framework has been set out, right? So I think we can expect more of this down the road. A lot of work still needs to be done by us in the room, right, as business owners, to really reinforce that message as we are talking to policymakers and governments to say that, look, ASEAN's put out something, right? Can we just make sure that when you introduce national policies, be as coherent as possible, right? Use it as a mapping standard because it helps businesses make sure that their internal compliance program is easy to manage. It makes it a lot easier to deploy products and services across Southeast Asia.
So I don't claim to be an expert on kind of the ASEAN discussions about this, but I was struck to notice that there was a kind of big delegation of folks from the EU who trooped to Southeast Asia last year and tried to persuade everyone to, let's link up. Let's have a common standard for both our markets, not just one market, and to adopt our kind of GDPR framework, and then it'll be easier for companies. And it makes a lot of sense, but the response was not very enthusiastic from Southeast Asia. And surprisingly, what the Southeast Asians said is actually we're very suspicious of over-regulation because we're afraid that we're going to miss out on some of the benefits of innovation, and these technologies will pass us by. So should we be discouraged by that, or in a way can we be encouraged by it if we think that at least in that regard, all these countries seem to have sort of a common outlook. There seemed to be something resembling a consensus on that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, loads. I'll jump in, but I would love to hear from my colleague here too. We're sort of a mix, a hybrid region, right? We're very diverse. We love each other, yet at the same time, we're always looking over our shoulder and wondering what our neighbors are doing. So our model has always tended to be a hybrid of both. Regulate when we need to regulate or we want to regulate, and regulation tend to come fast and quick here. So we always need to keep a sense of the pulse. But at the same time, we like to keep an ecosystem that's open to innovation, to test things out. And we like that. Because what you see happening in the EU is regulation comes up pretty quickly, and to a certain extent, it stifles innovation. So how do you do this balance? And I like what's happening in Thailand. I like what's happening in Singapore, where governments are reaching out and thinking about how do I partner up with the private sector to think about meaningful applications of AI. And I agree with my panelists here. In Southeast Asia, we're at the stage of application, not necessarily building up the technology from ground up per se. So governments really need to think about what makes sense for my country, and to ensure that the infrastructure available in the country supports the application. So for example, in Thailand 4.0, for example, looks at industry application of AI. And you know how they're gunning for a lot of EV investments in Thailand and making use of AI to automate certain technology, certain part of their manufacturing is putting them ahead of the game.
Yeah, I mean, Thailand is kind of streets ahead of almost everyone in the region in terms of adopting solar, I think.
Yeah, but also in terms of data centers, for example, like Malaysia is gunning for tier 3 data centers to make sure that cybersecurity, integrity, electricity availability supports the ecosystem. And similarly, in Singapore, we lifted our moratorium in late 2023, but placed very high standards for the next generation of data centers that's opening up. So really, government's role here is to partner up with private sector and to ensure that the ecosystem supports innovation and development of enterprise.
So I want to dig a little more deeply into that because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But Evie, do you have a thought about it?
I think just building on what you were talking about, Clay, with the campaign from the EU to sort of do something similar around AI here in the region as they did prior to GDPR. I think that where enterprises are trying to do something different is looking beyond concepts like being a good steward of the data and thinking about how AI systems interact with each other and the unique risks related to AI. And for that reason, there's a little bit different approach taken to the regulatory aspect. So the EU has the ability to be united in its enforcement of the EU AI Act, which I think is a big differentiating factor for why they're approaching the regulation the way they are.
Yeah, you've got to have a much more kind of consensus approach here.
Yeah, just one little addenda for that trade mission you mentioned, right? So while they came and, as you mentioned, they wanted to, evangelize GDPR, and there wasn't any take-up, right? But what came out of that? What came out of that was actually a joint effort between the European Commission, right, and ASEAN, and they came together and they did a mapping of the standard contractual clauses and model contractual clauses that came out of ASEAN, standard contractual clauses that came out of EU, because they recognize that trade needs to carry on between these two regions. So let's have some effort to try and map and make it a lot easier for businesses. So while there's a recognition that maybe some of these policies are not entirely suitable, but there is a recognition that trade needs to flow, data needs to flow, and it's that kind of spirit, I think, that we need to encourage.
Interesting. I want to leave some time to take some questions from the floor. If anybody's got burning queries, put your hand up and wave at us, and we'll recognize you. You mentioned the sort of things that many of these Southeast Asian nations have in common in terms of what they're looking for as a regulatory framework. But of course, there are individual, specific issues that relate to AI that often kind of put them at odds against each other. Data centers is one. As soon as the moratorium happened in Singapore, all the operators rushed across to Johor and started, in Indonesia, started putting up data centers there until there were more data centers across the border than there were here. And then the government went, maybe this is not what we want. So that's a kind of a frenemies example. The other one that's fascinating to me, and I don't, maybe none of you want to comment on this, but I spent a little bit of time looking in the Philippines, and the Philippines is very ambivalent about AI because of the job implications, right? You've got a very big population of people who are employed working at these call centers, and that's probably going to be one of the first places where companies are going to figure out that they can roll out interactive chatbots with generative AI. And so they're much less enthusiastic about how do you see that? Are there similar tensions in other economies as well, and are those insurmountable, or what?
There's a really good research piece done by Trisha at LinkedIn where they kind of did a study on the extent to which AI was going to disrupt the employment of an individual, or displace or augment, or it's completely non-applicable, right? And this study was done on Indonesia. So for the bulk of the population, AI would augment, or has the potential to augment. So what governments, since this panel is about government and governance, what governments need to start thinking about is how do I support my workforce in thinking about how to effectively leverage AI, and similarly for enterprises. We actually did research on AI in the BPO sector in the Philippines. And yes, there's a potential for massive displacement of the workforce. And so it's about how quickly can they go further up in the pecking order of skill sets, right? So it's a challenge. What you do see happening is Southeast Asia is still in that stage where we're figuring out adoption of AI. So we've got a bit of breathing space here for governments to think about how to effectively manage this.
I think even beyond the comments you made, thinking about how AI can supplement the existing workforce or better enable people to do even more beyond what they are currently doing. And the integral part of that is designing AI in a responsible and trustworthy way. If an enterprise is able to accurately see who is using AI at the company and how they're using it, they can actually maximize the benefits of things like generative AI, understanding and sharing prompts amongst employees so that you know, this is how my enterprise is using it, this is what's working for my employees, this is what's not working, and putting your own guardrails around it, I think is a really important part to it augmenting the workforce as opposed to replacing.
So a lot of this is it creates communication challenges and responsibilities, not just for companies, employers, but also for governments to say, oh, look, this is going to be net positive for all of us. There are going to be some winners and losers, but trust us, we're going to do what we can to try to adjust and adjudicate that, get people the skills they need. And that's hard, right? That's hard to do.
Well, I'm going to just add to say that well, I can't speak for Philippines and call center. I am quite involved in Singapore and legal sector. And legal sector is one of those that's expected to be disrupted by especially generative AI. But I think it all falls on us, wherever we are, to actually take the bull by the horns, right? So the Academy of Law has articulated a four-pronged approach to this. Number one, we actually need to just grapple with this and find ways to teach our lawyers not only to use AI, but also to teach them differently, because AI tools are going to make their way into tools that will help them become more productive and tools that the clients are going to use.
Yeah.
We need to work with solution providers to get AI solutions into the market so that they're using it, right? And of course, for us, right, we also want to make sure that lawyers learn how to do things like prompt engineering, right? Yeah. And of course, for our own products and services, we need to also use AI to enhance our feature set. So it's really up to us, wherever we are seated, to try and get something done, right? And not just wait for the disruption to happen, but let's try and get ahead of that.
Sounds like some thorny challenges. That is unfortunately all the time that we have, but please join me in thanking our panelists for a really fascinating discussion.